Wave your hands, take the stick.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Borisevich and his wife for such an instructive and amazing presentation. I guess the kernel of what I would like to say, which is mostly in reaction to that, is when we look and consider this particular tradition of sacred chants, I think it's important to bear in mind that the chant itself is a perennial tradition. It arises deeply out of culture, both pagan and Christian, and all religious cultures experience sacred chant in one form or another. And I think it strikes my mind as being not just simply the means of reciting religious texts, but the very mechanism by which these texts are appropriated to the internal world, our universe of meaning that we carry within ourselves. And I think to those ends, the experience of recent centuries is something that I think we're only just beginning to comprehend and to perhaps understand in a more subtle way, that music itself and its basis in religious life has experienced a process of decomposition. I think we can say that's been quite remarkable in the context of the Western world and the gradual secularization of church life, and we behold the fact that chant and liturgical life are intimately related to each other, and the sacred traditions of a culture informs in its turn the folk tradition. And so in the West, at least, in the last 50 years, there's been a very interesting movement called the early music movement, which has been mostly archaeological, I guess, in its focus, ploughing through monasteries and libraries and texts and traditions, and trying to find a way to overcome an almost ontological gap between our contemporary situation now and the historical past. I think the fundamental and core element of it is not simply acquiring a method of ploughing through religious ceremonies and texts and hopping on a particular ideological bandwagon in order to simply avail ourselves of the satisfaction of an esoteric discipline, or having acquired expertise in an area we can demonstrate this before a scholarly community, or make claims for ourselves based on archaeological discoveries, as it is in the secular world. I think what we're talking about is what is actually the content of our faith, of Christianity. Well, it's Christ himself. When chant itself ceases to be connected to that fundamental transmissional process, it becomes a museum. It becomes an interesting museum, a fascinating museum, a museum that is perhaps very nice to spend a little time in, but it's one that we will eventually leave. So I think when I look at what we've explored in the last couple of days, perhaps a cautionary tale for us is to make sure that we always have in mind that the ultimate purpose of this is part of our life, our salvation in Christ, and the communication of the core message of our faith. And under the circumstances I'm referring now mostly to the West, although this has certainly affected the Russian Church in the last couple of centuries, as we've explored these last few days, is the gradual disintegration of that relationship, not only between the text and the music, but in the final analysis also between the music and its the liturgical tradition and those who are standing in church, this experience that I think is altogether too familiar in churches east and west of the liturgical tradition being somewhere quite distant, an operative of a clerical elite or a group of specialists who are introduced into the inner mysteries of chant. As an aside to that, I mentioned that the perennial nature of the chant, I think, is also to be borne in mind here. When we've had an intense focus this few days on Znamenny chant and its tradition, I think we do well to have an ear out for its connections with the other great traditions, because they're all ultimately subtly connected. I think we had this discussion last time actually, where looking at having our first look at Kurki and the pneumatic notation, and I had a book which demonstrated the earlier notational systems in the Western Church, its major centres being Rome and Milan, Benevento, and many places besides. I can't remember them all. And what you see is, in fact, that there are variations on a theme, but there's a great unity between the liturgical traditions of singing, of church singing, in all of the major centres. Not exactly the same, but it's once the tradition itself begins to break down and we move to a quadratic system of notation and try to set things exactly, we can tell, as Gleb has very amply demonstrated, that there's a loss of confidence amongst those who are practicing the chant. And so it's at that point that great differences begin to emerge. And one thing I think I showed you last year was how there was a liturgical text from the Graduale written in England in about the 9th century in pneumatic notation. It's almost exactly the same in its central content as something written in Italy on the continent at about the same time. The pneumatic tradition of neumes, the notation, the text themselves, the language through which there was a great sense of unity. And I think one thing I would like to see is an exploration of the, where's Znamenny, what are the origins of its tradition? How far back do we go? Where does it really come from? And look, this is an open field. I guess the experience of the 20th century in Russia has meant that research can only be undertaken in this area now. So one interesting, there are numerous theories on the transmission of the tradition. Where did it come from? And it seems that in Znamenny chant that there's a mixing of genres and with its basis in Byzantine chant, which makes me wonder what will be the case in our country in 3 centuries, and that's the point I want to make. Really, is that
Father, I can add that coming from an iconographic perspective, we're very naive. We're simply ignorant if we think that because we have computers, cameras, aeroplanes, telephones, we distribute information easily or quickly. When you travel and study ancient monuments, the same as you go to libraries all over the world, you will see that the sharing of ideas, whether it's iconographic types or musical compositions, you can find, in the Italian catacombs, the post-Constantinian catacombs, all the way to Georgia and Armenia, all the way up to Pskov, the same composition.
Yeah.
That famous angel of Milesheva sitting like this, pointing to the tomb, is all over the world. Right? So people weren't slow, and ideas, good ideas, sure that you will also find it in music.
Or just like the angels on the iconostasis here look exactly the same as, you know, ancient carvings of the Babylonians, with showing the winged creatures of heaven. You know, these, the perennial nature of the chant. I guess we have a, you know, the ambient culture in which we're now sitting is, I don't want to say hostile, but it's not receptive to these ideas. And that's why an occasion like this is, even if it, you know, if it's modest in what we can actually take from it, it's at least a beginning. It seems to me that the analogy with iconography is a very good one, because if we look back only a century and a half, the tradition had almost ceased, hadn't it, Father Alexis?
Yes.
And, you know, through careful application and through study, through you know, through diligence and through you know, a prayerful attitude, gradually the tradition itself has been revived and now is you know, practiced in many places.
Liturgical reform for Russia is a very complex question, and I think we're still technically, if I put a not too fine a point or a too obtuse a point on the back, we're still technically in the dark ages as we re-emerge and try and still find a place, because liturgical reform in Russia is very it's looking back on it, it's trying to measure its past, and it's copying things and just putting things into place, like in Moscow and, you know, Petersburg. The style of liturgical reform is a replica of the 19th century. That's not actually anything moving forwards, and I think that creates a deeper divide, because it's not actually really educating people about liturgy, how the liturgy is sung, about musical tradition, and I think it's actually compounding a problem. And so this is sort of just so off a tangent from what is currently happening. It's very interesting what the Borisovich has been able to offer us. So I think that I'd be much more blunt in saying that we're still, people would say, oh yes, we're at a point of making a reform and changing, but I don't have to say that. We're technically still in dark ages in a very contemporary world.
It seems to me that the attitude, you know, an archaeological attitude of revival of everything, which, you know, the Western culture has experienced this for, you know, since the 19th century. The revival of previous styles, simply, you know, everything can be revived. Look, we can do that, can't we? I mean, we can, you know, attempt to technically master the material and put on very long all-night vigils, sung in, you know, in the most beautiful chant. But unless we've actually been able to break through into the actual content of it, it's of no point. You know, there's
you're playing theatre in different centuries.
Yes, that's right. This is, and for me, this is the you know, comes down to a practical level as to what we can take from this back to our own spiritual lives, back to our parishes, what we can share with our friends, without having, you know, World War III or having to have the eighth ecumenical council to resolve the new heresy of Znamenny chant. You know, the last thing we want to do is to create scandal. But I think if we can place this work within the broad cultural context of early music, which, you know, is a serious discipline, but one that has also matured a little bit. You know, instead of just the mere copying of what we create as our imagined historical past, we actually allow ourselves a right to creatively interact with the material. And this is where I see the great value in what the Borisovich has been able to give us, is at least an opening to this mysterious world of neumes. I'm going to finish very soon, because I only wanted to present a few thoughts to your consideration. But an analogy to this work that I know from my own lived experience is the state of Gregorian chant by the late 18th and early 19th century was a submerged tradition it remained in its very most rudimentary form as a few little things that the priest would sing during Vespers, Matins, or the Mass. And that was all. The rest of it, the entire liturgical tradition of the Western Church, which was by then very old, had been submerged beneath a very overgrown polyphonic orchestral tradition, which eventually needed to be cut back. This rode on the back of a group of monks in France who made it their work to collect manuscripts, to trawl through the vast libraries of Western Europe to attempt to recapture something of the original fire of sacred chant. Now, they weren't entirely successful, I must admit, because when the transmission itself is of the tradition is simply a technical detail of mastering pneumatic notation, the access is very limited. So what I know with some of the books that were produced in those 2 centuries, it's only very recently, in the last 30 years, that you have scholarly volumes of chant that come out with dual notation. So it will present the quadratic notation of the chant on one line. Quadratic notation has been cleaned up from later additions and modifications. What Gleb was explaining with the naonne pienie, with the omission of the singing vowels, also had its place within the Western tradition of elision of vowels, or when a noun ended on a consonant like S or T and began on a consonant, Sanctus Deus, there was always a vowel put in melismatic chant to join those 2 words, and to later editors this seemed to be a corruption and an improper addition into the text, where in fact it simply arose from the practice of chant when monasteries were flourishing, and the chant was a vital a vital aspect of the manner of prayer. It was the basic mechanism through which the content of Christianity was acquired. So this attempt to sort of reconnect through texts has only a limited capacity to do this. The others, there's another aspect, and I think in the presenting of the material with both systems of notation, what we can actually do, as you've shown in this panegyric, is that we can allow our limited knowledge of the earlier pneumatic notation to inform how we use the modern staff notation, which isn't to say that that's the preferred method. It's just simply a practical approach, so that we can take something from this. And that introduces the last point that I'd like to show Gleb Borisov, something that has been achieved very recently, actually, in the Russian Orthodox Church, a parish in America that uses the old rite, the pre-Niconian liturgical rite, Erie, Pennsylvania. And they've produced a Sunday Octoikos, basically the backbone of the services, presented as you would expect, with the text in the front. But if you turn to the back, what you see Father Pieman and the others there have done is really a marvellous work. They've got the canons for Matins, midnight service, and for Compline, according to the 8 tones, so that we can take this and begin to practice. And it comes with an instructional CD, which you can get from Erie, Pennsylvania. This is very, I think the 2 CDs in the book was under $100 plus postage, so it was very affordable. And it's this that I want to present to you, because we're here in... Вы можете спеть?
Да, мы по-английски.
Вместе, together.
Delivered from cruel bondage, Israel trusted
Глеб, this is going to be one of the most favorite YouTube recordings. Глеб Борисович singing in English, the first time probably in his life by Kriki.
But this is an important part of the transmissional history, because if you think about it, there was a time when the service in Russia was sung in Greek, and there was a first moment when the first words of the divine service were sung in the Slavonic tongue. There was a first time. So I think we shouldn't be. I think we should allow ourselves to be creative with this. I think we should allow ourselves to have the maximum amount of internal freedom. I think we should take the opportunity to learn a little about, or as much as we can, about the notational system, so that then we can, take this offering of Erie, Pennsylvania, they're obviously anxious to communicate the content and the form in this liturgical volume. I think Father Alexis mentioned just at the beginning of the conference that we also have to be aware of our context here in Australia. It's not simply a matter of transplanting a bush from one pot to another. We have a unique situation. We live basically in Asia, really. It's not Europe. Pascha is, we're still, what is it? The springtime of the soul, and we're just at the end of summer, and rather relieved that the heat is gradually disappearing. So, I was amazed as I have spent the last few months playing through this volume and listening to Father Pimmon's rather delightful recording, just himself on the CD. He has a not very nice voice, but he sings, and it's genuine and sincere, and so I commend this to you. I think my favourite one is the 9th ode, the Ode 9 Irmos from Tone 5, O Isaiah, rejoice. O Isaiah, rejoice, for the Virgin hath conceived in her womb, and born a son, Emmanuel, both God and man. Orient is his name, as we magnify him. Him we call the blessed, O Virgin. Now,
Пятый глаз. Я думал, пятерку за пение.
Это очень странно для вас на английском языке, да? No, but это почувствовано, что это пятый класс. So,
я думал, ты пятерку ставишь. Пятерку тоже, да?
But
it's a Benedictine Znamenny.
Is it Benedictine? Procedam in pace. No, they are my reactions, my thoughts, and my questions to you. These are the challenges we face. This is a liturgical tradition that now has become part of the English-speaking world through a whole century of translation. Now it seems that the opportunity to actually set those texts to music that can convey the essential content of them is now upon us. What do we do with it? We start.